We are beginning a series of discussions on genetics and inheritance. In particular, in this session, we want to discuss concepts of genetics and inheritance that have not held over the years. This individual you might recognize as Gregor Mendel. He did a lot of work with pea plants, and just because we associate him with pea plants, we don't often think about the true contributions he has made to genetics and inheritance over the years. But what we have to look at with Gregor is that he did a whole lot of math. And for a monk working with pea plants, math might not be something that would be forefront in your mind of his contributions. But when we look at genetics and inheritance, he put math and statistics to it. Made a whole world of difference for our thoughts on genetics and inheritance. We can certainly look at some highly variable organisms when we think about genetics and inheritance. If we think about both of these dogs, the Chihuahua on the left and the Great Dane on the right, both coming from the wolf, we have to think about how you could get an inheritance, a genetic passing on of traits that would allow a wolf line to eventually produce a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. Now, of course, this comes with a whole lot of human interference and something we call artificial selection. Very different than when we look at natural selection. We'll talk about this a lot. We'll talk about how some of our favorite dog breeds are having all kinds of difficulties, right? Because of genetic lines and problems with the genetics of some of these dogs. So we'll look at those effects and how science is trying to help that and decrease those issues. There are a number of topics that we'll discuss in this series, including Mendel. We'll look at variations on Mendel, how some of his ideas are terrific. He set up some great laws of genetics and inheritance, but we also have to think about where they don't always hold. Then we'll get into the chromosome and the genes associated with inheritance that we look at today. We have to keep in mind that Mendel had no idea what a gene was. So all of his work was based without any knowledge of genes or chromosomes. Pretty fascinating, the things he came up with that still hold today without that knowledge. And then finally we'll get into some specific sex-linked genes and chromosome issues, things that affect females versus males, males versus females, and where we can see some of those challenges in genetics and inheritance. When we first started out thinking about genetics and inheritance thousands of years ago, we actually started with something known as a pan-gene. Now, when we think about a pan-gene, we have to think about mom and dad coming together and producing gametes that will be passed on to the next generation. The thought is that with pan-genes, mom's producing an egg is normal, a dad is producing a sperm is normal, but that pieces of mom would actually break off and pieces of dad would break off to form these gametes. That's a little bizarre for us to think about. Those pieces, of course, today we would refer to more as chromosomes. But the biggest place where this has failed is the idea that characteristics acquired during your lifetime are passed on to your offspring, suggesting that if you spent a lot of time at the gym and you became very physically fit, you would pass on that physical fitness to your offspring, and in a sort of joking way, your children would be born with six-pack abs. They would be very, very fit straight out of the womb. Well, while your you may be passing on the genetics for those traits to be acquirable over the offspring's lifetime. They certainly are not born with the six-pack of abs. If you've ever seen a little pudgy baby belly, you certainly know that. Okay, so we've got to think about how we actually inherit traits. This is a great idea a couple of thousand years ago. Today we have to think about other directions. Another idea that often comes back to haunt genetics is blending. So this idea that if I take a red flower and I cross it with a white flower, I get a pink flower. Now, obviously for my picture, this may occur, but the idea was that by mixing the red and the white, you got the intermediate pink. What we have to keep in mind is every characteristic that we see is because of proteins. So we'll actually have to look at concentration of proteins to explain this. This is actually a phenomenon known as codominance, and we'll look at that more later. So when we talk about heredity and genetics, we have to be careful that we don't use these terms interchangeably. Genetics is a specific study that can consider heredity, but when we talk genetics, we're talking about genes, proteins, okay? But when we talk about heredity, what we want to know is what's being passed on to the next generation. That's the focus, okay? So we have to be careful with these terms. Two other terms that we have to be very, very careful with in our discussions are phenotype and genotype. These are not interchangeable terms. We can use one to describe another, but they cannot be used interchangeably. Phenotype is what you look like, your hair color, how tall you are, etc. The genotype is the gene, chromosome, and really ultimately DNA, right, that builds the protein that makes this happen. So a phenotype is how you would describe someone. What do they look like? The protein is the underlying code or directions or instructions for the phenotype. Be careful with these terms. Don't use them interchangeably, okay? You can certainly use one to describe another and how they interact, but we have to be very, very careful that they're not interchangeable. More on that later.